anybody remember who God used to write the book of Moses? He raised his hand to write the book of Romans for us. God used a man. Do you remember the name of the man that God used? Do you remember, Serenity? It wasn't Joseph. It was a New Testament man. Moses? Paul. What was the name that Paul had earlier in his life? Does anybody remember that he had two names? First we called him Ivanhoe? Saul. That's right. Remember Saul? He hated Christians. And then God saved him with a bright light. Well, he got his attention with a bright light. And Paul surrendered and said, Lord, what will you have me to do? And a little while after that, he was traveling, starting churches, and he started going by the name Paul. And in all the different stuff, he also wrote this verse. So let's think about what this verse says. So then every one of us. So who is this verse talking about? Is this verse talking about me? It's not talking about me? I don't know. Is it talking about you? God? I'm sorry. Let's just this first part. So then every one of us. So then every one of us. Is this verse talking about me? Is it talking about Wyland? No? Every one of us. Is it talking about Chloe? All kids think no. Serenity, is it talking about you? Yeah? Because it says every one of us, right? Miss Amanda, is it talking about you? Ivanhoe, is it talking about you? Moses? Let's try this again. Wyland, is it talking about you? It says every one of us. So Paul is writing. Now he's writing to Christians. So if you're not a Christian, maybe not exactly this verse, but really it's true. Every human. It's true about every single human being. So then every one of us shall give account. Shall give account of himself. So to give account means we're going to have to explain what we were doing. Have you ever, has your mom or your teacher or your dad ever said, come here, tell me what's going on? No? Tell me what was going on there. What did you do? What was your part? Did you ever have that happen? I have. What was your part in that? Maybe some shoving or pushing started happening, and mom or dad or the teacher or the principal said, okay, got it all broke up and said, now what was your part in that? And what was your part in that? So that means the teacher or the principal or mom or dad was saying, give an account. Okay? But this verse says, every one of us shall give an account of himself. So every single one of us someday is going to say what our part was, what we did, and who is going to be asking. Is it going to be the principal? Is it going to be mom or dad? What does the verse say? Who do we have to give our account to? In the verse it says, so then every one of us shall give account of himself to, class, to God. Yeah. So that means every single one of us, someday, Pastor Logan is going to stand before God and give an account. Miss Joy is going to stand before God. Mrs. Vogelin, you will stand before God. Your parents will stand before God, each one of them. Every one of us will stand before God and give account of what they've done. And that has to do with our lessons, because we are learning in our new set of lessons about how we should live. The lesson is called Living the Christian Life. We're still looking at the book of Romans, and in Romans, Paul wrote about how God condemns people, right? A long time back, we were learning about condemnation. Declared guilty, proven guilty, and sentence, judgment sentence. I think we even said that Moses stole some bananas or something like that. That is our illustration, right? So declared guilty. Who is declared guilty? Who's condemned? not Moses. No. In our story, Moses was, but in the book of Romans, who's condemned? Everybody, that's right. Everybody's condemned because they have not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God, right? We learned that verse. We said it just last week in our verse quizzing. And then we learned how God justifies. To justify says, like condemnation, but it's the opposite direction, declared righteous. So God can justify people who are condemned, meaning he can declare them right, but he does that. How can God justify people who are sinners? How can God justify people who are sinners? Does he just go around and say, oh, that sin doesn't matter? No, he doesn't do that. God can't just ignore sin. He has to judge sin. That's why he condemns all the sinners. But some sinners get justified. How do they get justified? By praying? People who pray are justified? Not exactly. Not exactly. Something happened. Something happened, and we're going to celebrate it yesterday and tomorrow, that made it so that God can justify people. Ivanhoe? You can just stay seated. Jesus died on the cross, didn't he? And then he rose from the dead. So Jesus died on the cross so that all the condemned people that believe on him could be justified. Once they're justified, we're sanctified. Remember the verse? But ye are washed, but ye are sanctified, but ye are justified. And so Paul wrote all those things, and after he was writing all those things, I don't know how he thought, but when we look at the book, we think he might have thought, well, what are some things? I told all of the Romans a bunch of things they should know, but now I want to tell them some things they should do. There's a difference, right? Some things we should know and things we should do. And so today and next week we're going to talk about things that Paul told us in the book of Romans that we should do. How should we live the Christian life? We should live in a certain way because one day every one of us will give account of himself to God, right? And so we should live a certain way so that when we give account, he will be pleased with what we've done. So we want every day, everything we do to please God. Now, we're going to remind ourselves of a story in the Old Testament to help us understand. Next thing to say is Romans 12:1. We learned this. I think we said it as part of our contest last week. I think. Romans 12:1. Let's see if you can follow along with me. Join me if you know it. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Now there's an important word there, and today we're going to talk about those two words, living sacrifice. Does anybody know what a sacrifice is? We don't make sacrifices like the Bible talks about in our world today. At least most people don't. But what was he talking about when he said a sacrifice? What is a sacrifice? Moses, what do you think a sacrifice is? Burn a lamb. Well, it has to do with that, yes. You would, sometimes Israelites would take a lamb, they would butcher it, they would skin it, they would put the lamb's meat and fat on an altar, they would sacrifice it. So that lamb that was theirs, was it worth anything after they sacrificed it? No, they gave it wholly, entirely. The whole thing was given as a sacrifice to who? To God, right? To God. So Paul in our verse says, I beseech you, ye, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice. So Paul is saying he wants each of us to present our bodies as a sacrifice. But he put a word in the middle there. He said, bodies, sacrifice. But he didn't want us to slit our throats and lay ourselves on on an altar and burn, right? Because he said, body's what kind of sacrifice? Chloe, you got it in your head, don't you? You don't? I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice. So, he's not asking people to kill themselves, but he is asking themselves to think about them like they're a sacrifice. Totally, can a sacrifice do anything? No, it does whatever it's offered to. So, a long, long time ago, do you remember the man Abraham? God promised Abraham that if he would, God promised him that he was going to bless him, and he was going to bless the whole world through Abraham. We talked about that for the last 4 weeks when we talked about Israel in the past, in the present, in the future. God said to Abraham, through you and through your children, I'm going to bless the whole world. And we talked about many things, ways that God did that. But when God promised Abraham that, he didn't have any children. Hard to bless the whole world through Abraham's children if he doesn't have any children, right? And then Abraham got older and older and older, and he didn't have any children. Finally, God kept his promise. He always keeps his promises, doesn't he? God kept his promise, and Abraham and Sarah had a son in their old age. Abraham was 100 years old. Most people in the world don't even live that old, but Abraham lived to 100, and when he was 100, he had a son, and they gave him so much joy, and they laughed, and how nobody would have ever thought that we would have children when we were this old. They even named their son a word that means laughter, and his name was Isaac. Abraham's son was Isaac, and Isaac grew, and I can just imagine as he was growing, maybe he was a little boy, it was time for him to go to bed, and Abraham and Sarah would just think, oh, we're so happy that God gave us Isaac. It's going to be wonderful. God kept his promise. He said he's going to bless the whole world through Isaac. Oh, it's so good. And they just thought about God's promises and how God promised that he would bless the world through Isaac. And we can't tell the whole story, but it wasn't just, I will bless the world through your children. God promised that he would bless the world through Isaac. Now, one day, God came to Abraham with a special command, a very important command. God came to him and said, well, let's just try to think about it the way Isaac would have remembered it. The next day, early in the morning, Abraham came to Isaac and said, hey, get up. God wants us to go make a special sacrifice to him. I've got the wood, I've got the fire, I've got the servants ready, we have the animals ready to carry stuff, and we're going to go together to make a special sacrifice. So early in the morning they went out and they walked. And they walked and they walked and they went north. They were staying in a place called Beersheba, and they walked and they walked and they walked. And at the end of that night, they could see there was a city on a hill, and just past the hill there was a little bit higher mountain, and it was called Moriah. And Abraham said, that's the place. That's where God says he wants us to make this sacrifice. And Isaac's dad was saying that, so they went to sleep that night outside in the valley, probably, and just a little ways away from that city. And in the morning, they kept going, and they got closer just past the city. And then Abraham said to his servants, you guys stay here with the stuff. Me and Isaac, we're going to go up to the top of the mountain and sacrifice to God. And so, Abraham had his knife, and Isaac, I think maybe he was carrying some wood. Abraham had some fire in something he could carry so he could light the sacrifice. And they started going up the hill to the top where they were going to do the sacrifice. And Isaac was not a baby. He was a young man, and he had brains in his head. And he started looking around. He said, okay, Dad's got his knife. He's got fire. I got wood. Seems like something's missing. Wyland, can you tell what's missing? Can you tell? Are you trying to think there? I'm saying no. You're tired? Can't. Too tired to think about this? So just listen then. Isaac has wood. Dad has a knife. Dad has a fire to start the sacrifice to roast it, to burn it. And Isaac says, seems like something's missing. Serenity, can you tell what's missing? The sheep. So Isaac says, Father, I have the wood, you have the fire, but where's the sheep? Where's the lamb for a sacrifice? And his dad said, Isaac, and he could tell his dad was thinking hard. The Lord will provide us a sacrifice, a lamb. Provide himself a lamb for a sacrifice. So they kept going, but Isaac's dad was really troubled. He didn't talk much. I don't think so. Finally, they got to the top, and they found some rocks, and they put them together to form an altar, and they put the wood on the altar. And then Isaac's dad said to him, Son, I don't understand exactly how all this is going to happen, but God told me 2 mornings ago to sacrifice you. To put you on the altar and sacrifice you. I don't know, can you imagine what Isaac would have thought? I can't. But he kept listening, and his dad said, I don't know how God will do this, but God has promised that he will bless the world through you. So it must mean that even if I sacrifice you in some way, God will raise you from the dead. I don't know what Isaac thought, but he must have believed his dad. He must have also believed God, because he didn't run away. He didn't run down the hill as fast as he could. He let his dad tie his hands so that he wouldn't crawl off the altar when it was time. So his dad tied his hands and laid him on top of the wood. It had to be super hard to do this. And then Abraham took his knife out. I can imagine he was probably crying. He loved his son. His son had brought him so much joy. But God asked him to do this. So, who does Abraham love more? God or his son? He loves God more, doesn't he? Yeah. And Isaac believed God. But Isaac had to be the one that was going to die and come back from the dead. That's hard to do. God would have had to do that. And so Abraham took his knife, and while it was in the air, all of a sudden, he heard an angel from heaven. Whew. And the angel said, Abraham, don't kill your son. Now I know that you will do whatever I tell you. And Isaac was laying there. Isaac, he kind of gave himself as a living sacrifice, didn't he? He ended up still living right there in the bushes. They didn't see it before, but right there in the bushes was a lamb. And Abraham did not kill Isaac. He did not sacrifice Isaac. But he saw the ram with his horn stuck in the bush, and they got him. They made that ram a sacrifice to God. Do you think Isaac was happy going down the mountain that day? Do you think Abraham was happy going down the mountain that day? That's right. But God learned something about Abraham that day, didn't he? He learned that whatever he asked him to do, he would do. Now, in all of history, in all the 6,000 years that people have lived on the earth, There's only been one time when God asked a man to do that. And that was Abraham. And God didn't have him kill his son, didn't he? But he wanted to know whether he would. He wanted to know whether everything that Abraham thought was in subjection, was in obedience to what God said. And it was. And Isaac, he was too, wasn't he? So God is never going to come to you and say, I want you to have your hands tied and get up on an altar and be killed. But does God come to us and tell us to do other things? He does. You know where we can see all the things that God tells us to do? Where can we read all the things that God tells us to do? Wyland? In the Bible. That's right. And in the Bible, there's lots of different things. And in fact, right in the chapter 12, there's a bunch more things right after that. Paul said to the Christians, I beseech you, I beg you, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And they must have been thinking, okay, what does that mean? And after that, he listed a whole bunch of things. He said, if God has given you the ability to preach, you should preach. If God has given you the ability to, you have a lot of means, you have a lot of money, and you can help others, you should do that. He says, none of you should think of yourself more highly than other people. Don't we like to do that? We walk into a room and we think, well, I'm better than that person, and I'm better than that person. But God says, don't do that. God says, be kind and help those that are poorer than you are. We might walk in a room and see people that don't have as much as us and think, well, I'm going to stay away from them. But does God say to do that? No. He says we should help those that don't have what we have. God says we should love people that hate us. Oh boy. We might be at school or might be somewhere and somebody's really mean to us. They did something wrong to us. God says, I don't want you I don't want you to get revenge on them. I don't want you to get them back. We like to get people back. Somebody comes to us and they're mean, and then we think, I'm going to get them back. But that's not what God wants us to do. We want to do that, but we have to sacrifice what we want and do what God wants, right? We want to not help people that don't have as much as us because we don't want to be around those kind of people. But we have to sacrifice that and do what God wants. We want to think about ourselves like we're really something, and those other kids in school or in our class at church are not that special. But God says, you need to sacrifice that. You need to think that they are special and you're not special. In fact, God says, we want, when somebody says something mean about us, we want to say something mean about them. But God says, no, I want you to sacrifice that, and I want you to say something kind about them. I want you to do nice things for those that hate you. And while you do that, I will make sure that they get the punishment they deserve. I understand that what they've done is wrong, but you are not the one to punish them. I will punish them. What I want you to do is to be kind to them. And we might sit there and say, but I don't want to be kind to them. And God says, no, I want you to give up what you want, and I want you to do what I want. You need to sacrifice yourself. You need to be a living sacrifice. A living sacrifice can make decisions, can't it? A living sacrifice says, yes, I'll do that, or no, I don't want to do that. And if we're a Christian, God says, I want you to be a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God. So when we make that decision, yes, I'll do that, no, I won't do that, how do we know whether we're holy and acceptable unto God? We have to see what God says. If God says to do this, we should be saying, because we're living, okay, God, I'm going to do this. If God says, don't do this, we say, I would like to do that, but I'm not going to do that because God said not to do it. I'm a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God. So, then, every one of us shall give account, right, of himself to God. Someday each of us are going to stand before God, and he's going to say, you think God can remember everything we've ever done? Yeah. Can we even remember everything we've ever done? No, but God can. He knows everything. He's going to say, right there, remember, I wanted you to do this, and you did that. That's good. Maybe there'll be another time he says, what about this time? I don't even know if he'll ask what we were thinking. But we know what we were thinking. Well, I want to do what I want. I know God wants one thing, but I really like this, and so I'm going to do it anyway. And we're going to have to give account. Every one of us will give account of himself to God. And so now, what we need to think about is what are we going to do this week? Not in the future when we stand before God. What are we going to do this week? What about later on today? What about later on today? You're going to have choices to make. Are you going to choose to do what God wants? Or are you going to choose to do what you want? What about tomorrow? Are you going to choose to do what God wants? Or are you going to choose to do what you want? What about when you go to school this week? You're going to be going back to school. You might see somebody that's been mean to you. Are you going to do what God wants and be kind to them? Or are you going to do what you want and get them back? Every one of us will give account of himself to God. Okay. Oh, and look at this. I know the Lord has made a way for me. So you say, how can I do that? That's so hard, I can't do that. But God has made a way for us. We can depend on his strength. We can obey him. As soon as we start obeying him, he helps us obey him the rest of the way. And so, because he's made a way for me, so I'll live for him each day in the things I do. And say, this is a good song. I don't even know if Miss Amanda knew that it would go with our lesson, but it went perfectly with our